Well, I want to do a little activity now that teaches you something about the brain. And so if all of you would just hold your head up like this, and your hand now represents the brain. And from the palm of your hand down to the wrist, that's the midbrain, the primitive brain, that has a very important function. You know, it regulates all of your autonomic, like your breathing, your heart rate. Now bring your thumb into the palm of your hand, and this is the midbrain. And the midbrain is where you have the fight-flight response. And it's also where we store some of those old memories of inadequacy and fear and some of the judgments we've made about ourselves and others. Now bring your fingers down over that midbrain, and you've got the cortex. And the back of the cortex is where it regulates your senses, your touch, your sight, your feeling. And the front of the brain is the only place where thinking takes place, and especially the prefrontal cortex. And this is what it regulates so many things like relationships and self-control and thinking, you know, rational thinking. And do you know what happens sometimes when you get upset? Like maybe you're upset about something that your ex-spouse has done or one of your children or whatever. Anyway, you get real upset. So guess what happens? Not as long as it's this way, but what happens is you flip your lid. And so what happens when you flip your lid? What is exposed? That's where you have the fight-flight response. And usually when you create that distance and hostility, the other person will flip their lid. And so this is when you're trying to communicate. You know, fight-flight response and old memories to fight-flight response. And it's like, you can think of this in your relationships with adults, but also with your kids. You know, often they do something, we get upset, they get upset. And is this the time to try and solve a conflict? And this is why it's when we understand this, and I often suggest that parents, as soon as their children are old enough, you teach them about this. And so that what you need to do is wait until you can calm down and engage your rational brain again. And this is where timeout goes. And you know, we talk a lot about not using negative timeout, where we say, you go think about what you did, which is one of the silliest things you can ever say to a child, as though you can control what they're going to think about. But we do advocate positive timeout. And that's where you get your children to create a positive area that will make them feel good. And if you sit down with your children and you say, what would help you to feel good? Would it be an area that would have books and CDs and stuffed animals, cushions, or whatever it would be, and then let them name it something else? And the reason it's important to have them name it something else is because there's still that negative, punitive connotation about timeout. And so my kids have called it space or a cool down place. You know, my granddaughter decided to call hers Bob. You know, it's like, but it really helps for them to be creative. And then instead of sending them there, it's so much more helpful if you ask them, would it help you to go to your feel-good place or to Bob? And but my feeling too, though, is if kids aren't old enough to understand this, they're not old enough to understand any kind of timeout. If they can't understand this, how can they understand what timeout means? Except there's always exceptions. One woman after a lecture came up to me and she said how she had used this with an 18-month-old child because her 18-month-old child had her little silky pillow that she just loved. And so she'd be feeling upset or crying, and she said, would it help you to go lay on your silky pillow? And the little girl would say, yes. And she'd say, you want me to go with you? And I love that sometimes she would just go with her. And this is another thing about positive timeout that I suggest sometimes, that you just say, would it help you? And they might say no. And you say, would you like me to go with you? And they still say no. And then you say, okay, I think I'll go to mine. And then you just turn around and go to yours, because isn't that a great model? Now, can you see how you might use this knowledge about the brain before you interact with the relationships that can get you going and create upset and